Hello. Um, that was a really creepy start. Um, Today's video is going to be me going through the approach of behaviourism. So behaviourism is part of the. Sorry, that makes me look like I'm at the head of the dog. That is a dog, by the way. Behaviourism is a branch of the learning approaches. And behaviorism is split into both operant and classical conditioning. So it's that we're going to be learning about today. However, the other branch of social learning theory is going to be in another video, right? So this is part of the learning approaches. Now, I'm going to skip a few slides here because they're not always necessarily useful at the start. So essentially what we're going to be looking at here is behaviorism, right? Now, a fundamental part of behaviorism is this concept, this philosophical concept that we are born as tabula rasa, a blank slate, right? So some of you, probably most of you actually, will believe this, that we are all born exactly the same. Of course, we have different genes. Of course, we have different biological processes, but essentially who we are and our behavior is exactly the same. And the second that umbilical cord is cut, our experiences and our environments will start to write upon our slate. Some people don't believe this. Some people feel very strongly about this. I personally think that I think we are tabula rasa. I think we are a blank slate when we're born. But it is a philosophical debate, so there is no right or wrong answer, though generally what I think is generally right. So we'll just say it's right. So tabula rasa. Now that's fundamental, right? And that kind of ties in with this idea about according to the learning approaches, the environment and specifically learning from our environment is the main driver and explainer of all our behavior. So this approach rejects genes, it rejects biochemistry, it rejects the cognitive approach, psychodynamic humanism, for example. It says that our behavior is caused by how we learn from our environment. No, that's not necessarily true. Some of us don't learn from our environment, but we're going to go through it today. So one of the key points that you're going to need to wrap your head around, and I will go through this a little bit later on, but is Pavlov's research. This bullet point that I'm going through today has two named pieces of research, Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. And you need to know what they did with rats and pigeons and dogs, right? You need to know. I've got a sheet coming up. These do have I haven't put the thing on. These do have a lot of voice notes, my slides. So can we make sure that we are listening to this? Because most students aren't very confident with the mechanisms of Pavlov. But I'm going to go through that. I'm going to go through that in time, in a few slides' time. So let's go through some of the main assumptions of behaviorism. We're born blank slate. We've done that, right? This approach is an extremist argument, and it's the nurture end of the nature-nurture debate, for example, right? So this approach believes that your behaviors are entirely determined by your environment. So it says that you, A, have no free will. It says that it's entirely nurture. So again, there's no nature involved. It's quite reductionist, this approach. This approach is very reductionist. All of these three things, by the way, are good evaluations. What do I mean by reductionism in this case, but specifically environmental reductionism, is this concept that, what am I trying to say? Is this concept that complex behavior can be reduced down to us simply learning stimulus response, right? And more on that later. Okay, so operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and as I said, it's different to social learning theory. Let's start with the first one, right? Calm yourselves. I know looking straight into his eyes can make you feel weak at the knees, but Ivan Pavlov is who you need to know for classical conditioning. Um, Classical conditioning came first. Classical conditioning is learning through association. So, a couple of things you need to note down about learning through association or classical conditioning. It's unconscious. You are not aware you are learning. Try think about a time where you haven't actually consciously gone, "Oh shit, I need to learn this." Maybe when you've paired two things together. So, for example, a classic example that I talk about is if you listen to an album 3 or 4 times, 5 times maybe, by the fourth or fifth time, you're starting to know the end of one song and you pair it with the start of another song. And maybe when one song finishes, you then start singing the melody of the next song before it even starts playing. So what you've done is you've basically slowly paired them two together. Now you're not there with your headphones on going, right, I must learn this, I must learn this. That's not what you do. We are learning in the background the whole time. So it's unconscious, it's passive, as in you don't put any active processes into learning it. And it's often involuntary. Those three terms are quite similar, but there are subtle differences between them. So learning through association is unconscious, it's passive, and it's involuntary, as in you don't get a choice to do it. So, how do we do this? And you need to know Pavlov's actual research. You need to know what he did to the dogs. You need to know how he did it. This is essentially what he did, to be fair. But I'm going to go through the 3 stages, and this is really, really, really important, right? It's really important that you get this terminology because I don't think a lot of students actually do understand this that well. I think they know the terms, but they don't understand them. So, let's use Pavlov's example, right? So, before conditioning, before you've learned from the environment, right? That's what I'm saying. Before conditioning, you have a bell and a dog, and the bell is the neutral stimulus in this case. So, what do we mean by neutral stimulus? That bell at the beginning has no impact on the dog whatsoever because it's neutral. Right, so the neutral stimulus, and again, write this down. I shouldn't have to keep saying that. The neutral stimulus is the thing at the beginning that has no impact upon, in this case, the dog. The food did have an impact on the dogs. This is all before conditioning. So the food is what's called the unconditioned stimulus, and the saliva or the salivation is the unconditioned response. So before conditioning, again, you may want to pause this once or twice, 1 or 2 times, but before conditioning, you have a neutral stimulus, which does nothing. But you do have an unconditioned stimulus, which has an unconditioned response, right? And that's involuntary, that's unconscious, that's passive. The dog is not aware that they've learned this. The dog is not, it's not choosing, I'm not going to salivate this time. Right, so that's before conditioning. You also need to know during conditioning. So this is the second stage. So what you are essentially doing here is you're pairing 2 things together. So what Pavlov did was, when he put the food out, he would also ring a bell at the same time. Now, slowly, the dog, whilst lacking somewhat in intelligence, will pair those 2 together. Every time there's food, there's a bell. Every time there's food, there's a bell. Every time there's food, there's a bell. And eventually, the bell, in this case, which is still the neutral stimulus, will start to have more of a role. Now, if you do that 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, the dog is going to slowly pair them together until afterwards, this is what happens. The bell has now become the conditioned stimulus. So essentially, one thing you do need to know here is the neutral stimulus eventually becomes the conditioned stimulus. Now, all these terms being thrown around, etc., you pay particular attention to this slide because, like I said, I don't think students are particularly confident on this. So the bell will have a conditioned response of salivation. Essentially, what has happened is you've paired these 2 together so many times that all you now need to get the dog to salivate is the bell. You don't even need the food anymore. So it says down the bottom how this may be used to learn or condition a fear is, let me give you a brief example of bullying in school. At the beginning, the neutral stimulus is school. School doesn't have any impact on the kid, right? School has no impact on the kid, right? Right? I could grab a kid who's maybe being bullied just at the start, and then like just show them school. Right? That'd be, I think, picking the kid up by the head and showing them school is probably, maybe I'm the bully, I don't know, right? Now, at the beginning, school doesn't have any impact. But what happens is every time the kid gets bullied, he or she is pairing it with school, because bullying always happens in school, right? Until eventually, bully at school, bully at the school gates, bully at the school canteen, school, and eventually the kid is learning. He or she is associating the bullying with school until, to get to the point where it's become so associated, all you have to do is pick up the kid and show them. I don't know why I keep using this. Is show them the school, and they're going to have that phobic fear that they get, that they've associated with phobias. So with bullying, sorry. So you do need to understand it. It's quite complex, I think. Now that is operant conditioning, right? Have a look at the resource sheets on Google Classroom. That's easy. That's straightforward, or Google site. The other one you need to know about is a bit more complex, and there's a lot more to operant conditioning. This here is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is a very controversial figure, by the way. He believed that you could get humans to literally do anything by rewarding or punishing them. Right, anything, right? Now, that's quite a simplistic view of humanity, I think. But he believed you could train people to be murderers just by punishing them and rewarding them for certain things. Very controversial. So it's a bit similar in the sense of they used animal research, but particularly he used the Skinner box, which is on the screen now. The rat or the pigeon or whatever animal he would use would have two levers in a box. One lever would drop down a food pellet, and that would clearly be a reward, because food is pleasure, food is reward, isn't it? Food is life, really. And one lever would shock the floor, would send an electric volt through the floor. And the very basics of the experiment is the animal learned pretty bloody quickly not to push the one that was electrifying them. If an animal can do that, obviously you would expect humans to be able to learn pretty quickly as well. So this is based on a few things. I'm going to go through this. Now, again, I haven't gone through the research in a lot of detail. Look at the resource sheets. Both of these are named, so you need to be able to know and evaluate these particular pieces of research. I may show you the resource sheets later on. I do have them. But there's a couple of terms you do need to know here, particularly for operant conditioning. So the first one is positive reinforcement. And now the students do get confused between these because they are very, very slightly different. Positive reinforcement is praising somebody or rewarding somebody for doing something good, right? There's slightly different definition on here, so you may want to write down either one you think is going to be useful, but it's essentially rewarding someone for desirable behaviors by giving them pleasant consequences. If you answer a brilliant question, I will praise you and clap you, and students tend to feel quite good about that, right? When they're outed in the class for being brilliant, the students tend to like that, right? So they get a shot of dopamine, shot of oxytocin, shot of serotonin, for example. Oh, yeah. Oh, I feel quite good. I'm going to do it again, right? Hence the reason the same people ask questions all the time. Punishment is something slightly different, right? So it's giving somebody a punishment. So I'm not taking away anything here. Giving somebody a punishment, so like a slap round the head, for example, to try decrease a behavior. So this isn't about increasing a behavior. This is trying to decrease. Now, we all know what punishment is. A lot of you have suffered punishment. You've been grounded. You've had detentions, for example. Think about what they are trying to do. They are giving you something. So detentions are giving you a detention to try stop you doing something. Negative reinforcement is something slightly different. And whenever I think of negative reinforcement, I always think of hunger. Hunger's a good example. So what I'm going to try do in this case is negative reinforcement is when you do a behavior to remove something unpleasant. You do a behavior to remove something unpleasant. So eating, for example, I won't have any food. Where my nuts have gone? Oh, I can smell them. I don't have any food. Anyway, sorry, I'm thinking about food now. Hunger, in this case, a negative reinforcement is when you will eat to remove hunger. Now, when you eat, it feels nice. You are getting rid of that universally hated feeling of hunger. And you're being reinforced basically. So you eat, you get rid of hunger, you're being rewarded for getting rid of you're being rewarded for eating by taking away that horrible feeling. There is also another one. You can have like positive punishment and negative punishment as well, but I'm not going to go through those now. Another trust me, there's loads of these little teeny tiny bits of slides. So schedules of reinforcement are also quite popular, quite don't know why they're not popular. They're quite important, that's what I'm trying to say. You can have two types of schedules. Continuous reinforcement is when the behavior is reinforced every single time the behavior shows, and obviously that's going to lead to a stronger response. So if you were, let's say for example, you start swearing in my class. Now I swear in my class quite a lot, but it's my class, so I can do all the bloody shit and how I want. But see what I did there? I swore when I was, it's fun. If you start swearing in my class, and I don't know, every time you dropped the F-bomb or something, I came over and slapped you on the head. It would be much more effective if I did that continuously, every single time. You'd learn very, very, very quickly. Whereas partial reinforcement tends to have a weaker effect. If I slap you every 1 in 3 times, or if I were to slap you every now and again, you're not going to learn. So continuous reinforcement is important. What you need to know here, the practical applications for parenthood are huge, by the way, and teaching are massive. Should we tell a kid off every single time they do something bad? Should we reward them every time they do something good? Continuous and partial reinforcement kind of suggest an answer. And this all leads to what's called the law of effect. This is another part of operant conditioning. The law of effect is the very, very, very basic law. Any behavior that is rewarded will be repeated. So think back to your primary school, for example. If you did something good, how were you rewarded for it? What kind of house point system did you have? Like mini Hogwarts system did you have? Any behavior that is punished means the connections to the situation will become weaker. I'll go through that. And the behavior, spelled the American way for some reason, and the behavior of response is less likely to occur, which leads to extinction. So extinction or extinguishing of the behavior essentially happens when you punish somebody for a certain behavior. I got that definition from somewhere, hence the Americanism. Just trying to think if that's a better way if there's a better way, I would explain it. Any behavior that's punished means that the connections to the situation become weaker. The behavior is less likely to occur when the situation is repeated. That's essentially what I just said. Okay. There was something else I was going to talk about this. Do I talk about time contiguity? Oh, I do talk about time contiguity. Okay. I will mention time contiguity now. Time contiguity, and again, please note this down because this is really important. Time contiguity is the concept of being rewarded either immediately after the behavior is done or quite a while after. Imagine you drop the C-bomb in my class. Let's not go into what that word actually is, but imagine if you were to drop the C-bomb. What do you think would be more effective? If I were to sprint over to, like you're talking to your friend, I'm like at the front talking to someone else and you drop it and I hear it, right? What do you think is more impactful? I drop that conversation and I sprint full speed over to you, I leap in the air and slap you right round the head for dropping the C-bomb in my class. And you dropped it like 2 or 3 seconds before I slapped you. Or I hear it, I don't tell you off, you leave the class, you come back to lesson 2 days later, right? And as you walk in the class, I slap you around the head. What do you think is going to be more important? What do you think is going to be more impactful? Clearly, the sooner you, and again, write this down, time contiguity, the sooner you are reinforced or punished for your behavior, the quicker you will learn the behavior. What's the problem with prisoners? They commit criminal acts, but they're not actually punished until years later, sometimes, often at least 6 months. So prisons don't really have good, the justice system does not have good time contiguity. By the time you're sentenced, it's been 6 months. You don't learn to connect the punishment to your actual behavior. Hence the reason the recidivism, the reoffending rate in this country is around about 50%. So really, really good practical applications to know here. As something else to do with operant conditioning, stimulus generalization. So stimulus generalization is basically when we take what we've learned in a new situation and apply it onto similar situations. So it's the ability to behave in a new situation in a way that has been learned in other. So for example, your learning of what it is to be a student is then applied to all situations whereby you are a student. So if you learn how to act in a student in my class, when you go to your business or your biology or your PE lessons or your art lessons, you will kind of apply this out. So this is also seen in phobias, by the way, where people take their phobia and they become phobic of all similar stimuli. So they generalize it out. So for example, little Albert's a classic study of this, where he was afraid of a white rat. He was afraid of a white rat, but then he generalized that out to rabbits, clouds, Santa's beard, apparently, because anything white or fluffy. So stimulus generalization happens that way. One trial learning is essentially when you have learnt the behavior in one trial. You've learned the behavior in one trial. So the theory of one trial learning states that learning takes place in a single pairing, a single incident, and it's not strengthened by repeated exposure. So phobias also have one trial learning. If you get bitten by a spider, you don't learn the phobia the 5th time you've been bitten. You will learn the phobia one time. So one trial learning is quite important, particularly for phobias that you kind of need to know. And again, time contiguity also is quite important here. And then finally, spontaneous recovery. Look, there's so many terms to operant conditioning. It's truly a massive theory. Spontaneous recovery is exactly that, right? It's recovery that comes out of nowhere with a behavior that's thought to be extinct. So this does actually happen to a lot of people. You've punished someone, and you've extinguished the behavior, right? And then randomly it can randomly reappear again. So for example, Pavlov's dog's salivation became extinct after a short period of time. So basically, Pavlov was ringing the bell and salivating, ringing the bell, salivating, ringing the bell, salivating, but food wasn't appearing. After a while, the dogs, that behavior became extinct. So they relearnt the bell didn't mean food, right? Then out of nowhere, he would ring the bell kind of a few months later and they would start salivating again. So spontaneous recovery is when you think a behavior has been extinguished, but it makes a random recovery again. I think there is an example here which I'm not going to go into, but if you don't understand spontaneous recovery, it might be worth pausing the video and just having a read of that, because I think it's quite a good example. So in terms of evaluations, there's quite a lot here, right? And I'm going to quickly go how you would elaborate on them as well. So allow psychologists to investigate the effect of the environment on behavior, right? Firstly, that's a crap strength. Let's move on. Behaviorism tends to be very scientific and usually uses controlled experimental methods. The elaboration is there. It enhances psychology's status as a science. It uses objective measures. It's empirical, so you can usually see the learning. Think about how many times the rats push the lever. Think about, you could literally count the amount of saliva that was being dripped into the saliva pots that were injected underneath the dog's glands. You can see this. It's empirical. Another one, it does provide a strong counter argument to the nature side. So it acts as a counterweight to the biological approach, and it has an incredible amount of practical applications, by the way. Why is this good? People aren't very good at elaborating on practical applications. A good thing about it having practical applications is that it shows it can have tangible effects upon improving the lives of society, and maybe even improving the quality of life of people suffering mental health disorders, e.g. phobias, for example. So that would be how you elaborate on that. And it's often backed up by research into humans and animals. In terms of limitations, it's environmentally reductionist. Why is that bad? It's parochial. It's narrow-minded. Therefore, the practical applications that come from it are probably going to be based on a narrow mindset, and therefore they're not going to be effective. That would be how you elaborate on it. That would be where that would come from. Tends to rely on lab experiments, quite a common one, quite unethical. Think about Pavlov's dogs. Think about a lot of the research that goes into behaviorism. It does tend to be quite unethical. And there's a couple of strengths here as well. So a couple of model answers, which I'm not necessarily going to go through. You do need to make sure you are going through these. I'm pretty sure you can read them yourself. I'm just going to put myself up there. So one of behaviorism's greatest strengths is its lie in its ability to easily be applied to a wide range. Behaviorism is used in so many attempts to explain behavior. Honestly, it's one of the most easily adaptable and applicable pieces of theory. It really is quite useful. Why is that good? Well, it's extremely useful, and the fact that it's being successfully applied so much actually gives it heightened credibility, and actually it's very good at explaining behavior modification. A weakness of behaviorism, though, is that it's too simplistic. Humans are far too complex for us to simply learn from the environment. We think about things, we have biological processes, and they're completely negated by this. So again, I'm not going to go through this, but if you feel like you are struggling, particularly have a look at the elaboration. That for me is what separates out the good answers from the excellent answers, is your ability to say, so what? This is your point. Who cares? So what? Right? What's a consequence of your point? All too often people go, this is my point, this is the evidence, and I'll link back. I'm like, no, but you're not telling me why your point's important. So definitely worth making sure you do that. A couple of tough exam questions, but that's pretty much it. Quite a long video for behaviorism. Make sure you check out the social learning theory. And one key thing you have to do, by the way, you have to be able to know the difference between social learning theory and behaviorism. If I were to give you a 60 marker on that, all right, my students are trying to get me to do an outro, so like or subscribe or do whatever the hell you want. I don't care. Right, hope that was useful.